Hello, and welcome to the digital premiere of our Monticello to Main Street tour. I'm Gail Jessup White, Public Relations and Community Engagement Officer here at Monticello. Based largely on the research of Monticello historian Cinder Stanton, this tour shares the stories of local freedmen once enslaved by Thomas Jefferson and their descendants who helped build the town of Charlottesville after leaving Monticello. Members of the Fawcett, Hemmings, West, Bell, Isaacs, and Scott families built lives, raised families, and became important figures in Charlottesville. They also faced challenges of separation as free family members struggled to maintain relationships with their enslaved kin. For generations, they and their descendants navigated the color line and triumphed in creating community despite the harsh realities of racism all around them. We're starting here at Monticello, where my ancestor, Thomas Jefferson, held more than 400 people in bondage during his lifetime, including my great-great-great-grandfather, Peter Hemmings, and members of his family. As you'll see during today's digital tour, and when visiting Monticello in person, the stories are complicated. Charlottesville is a mere 2 miles from Monticello, but the journey we'll go on today will be at times heartbreaking, challenging, and uplifting. Here to lead you on that journey are my colleagues Liz Marshall and David Thorson.
Hi, I'm David Thorson. I'm a guide at Monticello. I've been a guide for 10 years, so I have a deep love of history. My past background, I was in the U.S. Navy for over 30 years, but throughout that time I always carried a love of history. And living here in Charlottesville, history is all around us. Not only the history of Monticello, of Thomas Jefferson, but the history of the entire community, free and enslaved, who once called this their home. We're in downtown Charlottesville. Really, we're at Court Square, and 200 years ago, this is downtown Charlottesville. The building right here is the Albemarle County Courthouse. It was built in 1802. It's the original courthouse building that I'm pointing at, built on over the years. So who's practicing law here? Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe. Where's downtown Charlottesville today? Well, it's that way. It's to the south. That's where Main Street is. But Main Street was just a collection of ramshackle buildings 200 years ago. This is the center of the city. It's also the center of power in the city. And how big is the city of Charlottesville 200 years ago? It's less than 1,000 people. Imagine this. Over 40% of the people living here in Charlottesville are held in bondage. They're enslaved. 40% of the population held in bondage. So this courthouse, we can think of it as a place of justice where Thomas Jefferson practiced law. But could it be a place of injustice? Because others are entering this courthouse. Free blacks are entering this courthouse to register because that's what the law requires of them. So there's members of the Hemmings family, other free blacks, every 5 years legally required to register their status under the law. The first day of every month is court day. So that's a big event here in the county of Albemarle. It's bringing people from all around the county to do their business. They're doing legal business here. Criminal cases, civil cases, property transactions, buying, selling, recording deeds. Court day is, well, it's like a farmer's market as well because of all the people. So items are being bought and sold. And among the items being bought and sold are human beings. Human beings being sold right in the footprint of the courthouse, right across the street where my colleague Liz Marshall is standing. She's standing right there where the auction block once stood. And Liz is going to give you some more information about court day, about those auctions of human beings.
Hi, my name is Liz Marshall. I'm a guide at Monticello. And I'm standing across from the courthouse. This was called Court Square. You probably already heard that from David. And as you know, some of these buildings that you're going to see here are actually original buildings, as was this one. This is an original structure also. It's called Number Nothing, and it was a mercantile. And right in front of this mercantile, there was an auction block, sometimes called a slave auction block, and sometimes called an auction bench, which tells us that it had to be risen. It was probably long enough not just for one person, but for multiple people, possibly including families. So men, women, and children were being sold and bought here. There have been plaques throughout the years. Sometimes the plaque was on a building, and sometimes the plaque was on the ground. This is one of those plaques, or a vision of it. This one was taken in April of 2016. And you'll notice that someone made a modification. And I think you can figure out what the word probably was underneath it, and that word would have been slaves. This word is people. It would have been right here. So we're just to the east of Court Square now, and some of these buildings are original buildings. Some of them are on the site of where buildings were located that were made out of wood. Obviously, these changed. And actually, this is the site of where the watchmaker would have lived with his wife here in Charlottesville. And there would have been a public library here as well. We call this tour Monticello to Main Street. In fact, Monticello is just 2 miles in that direction. And the story begins really with one person, and her name is Mary. Mary was 25 years old when she left Monticello and moved to Main Street. She had 4 young children, and they came with her as well. She was a Black woman of mixed heritage. Her mother, Elizabeth Hemings, was also a Black woman of mixed heritage. And this family extended into larger families and larger families here in Charlottesville. One of the family members, and this would be Mary's grandson, his name is Robert Scott. And Robert Scott has an interesting story. Some of the stories you're going to hear will break your heart, and some of the stories you hear will fill your heart.
We're here on the downtown mall. Actually, we're right here at 2nd Street and Main Street. The building behind me is the Wells Fargo building, but 200 years ago, this is the very spot of the home of the Bell family, of the Scott family, the home of Robert Scott. My colleague, Liz, she has an image of the Bell Scott house that stood right here on this very corner. Robert Scott once called this very place his home. He had a remarkable life. And Robert Scott's life, in many ways, connects all the members of the Hemings family. He's born in 1803. He dies in 1899. His life spans almost the entire 19th century. He lives over the course of the administrations of 22 presidents. He's straddling the lines between white and black identity. He's code switching really all of his life. He's in and out of the courthouse all of his life for various reasons. He goes to school, to a white school with Jefferson's grandsons. So is he socially white, legally black, legally white, socially black? That becomes the endless question throughout Robert Scott's life. Now, his grandmother is Mary Hemings Bell, owned as property by Thomas Jefferson, leased by Jefferson to Colonel Thomas Bell, whose store and whose home was right here. His dad, Jesse Scott, who was Native American by ancestry, who became one of the most famous musicians, fiddle players in Virginia history, who taught both his sons, Robert and William Scott, how to play the fiddle. And the Fiddling Scotts became a trio known throughout Virginia, throughout all of the South, for their musical skills. Robert Scott goes into the courthouse 3 times to register as a free black, but in 1857 he goes into that courthouse to have himself legally declared to be not a Negro, taking advantage of a law that said if you could prove that you were of less than 25% African American ancestry, you could be granted privileges, or as the law says, not be subject to disabilities imposed on free blacks. So what is he? Is he white? No. Is he black? No. Yes. He's not a Negro. That's what the law says. He's straddling those lines again. And living socially as white, does he know that he's black? He tells a biographer that he has scarcely a drop of Negro blood. So what's he really saying? Is he code switching again, saying he's acknowledging his African American ancestry? When his brother, co-owner of this property, dies, he goes to court to try to save the property all for himself, but his niece sues to gain her share of the property. Now his brother, William, lived openly as an African American. He was married before the Civil War. His marriage wasn't legally recognized, but the law had changed, and his niece, Robert Scott's niece, successfully sues to have Robert Scott declared to be what? Black, and that the marriage between her father and mother legal. She gets the property as a result, and Robert Scott then loses his home. Mary Hemings is really the first member of the Hemings family to find freedom here in Charlottesville. How does that happen? You know, when Jefferson is in Paris as minister to France from 1784 to 1789, he's renting, leasing out members of the enslaved community. And one of those people is Mary Hemings, leased to Colonel Thomas Bell, veteran of the American Revolution, who established himself as a businessman, who became an Albemarle County magistrate, right? He's a man with power in this community. They form a relationship. They have 2 children. When Jefferson comes back from France, Colonel Bell convinces Jefferson to sell Mary Hemings to him. And they live openly in what, well, today we'd call it a common law marriage. They have 2 children. But Mary Hemings left 4 children behind at Monticello. Jefferson wouldn't allow those children to be part of the bargain. That's a major event, because now what's the status of Mary Hemings Bell, of her children, Robert Washington Bell, of Sarah Bell? And then onto the scene comes a remarkable fiddle player, Jesse Scott. He marries Sally Bell in 1802, and so the Bell-Scott house right here becomes the center of family life for the Bell-Scott family, and becomes the center of family life for the Fawcett family. When Thomas Jefferson dies in 1826, he frees Joseph Fawcett, Monticello's blacksmith, but Joseph Fawcett watches his entire family sold before his eyes on a cold January day. And Joseph Fawcett's making arrangements to have citizens of Charlottesville buy his family with the promise that he could free that family in the future. And he devotes his life, 10 years of his life, to that very process. So just behind us, the Fawcett family is living. They're part of that extended family. But one member is not living here, and that's Peter Fawcett, whose new owner, Colonel John R. Jones, wouldn't sell him. And so imagine encountering your own family, some in freedom, some in slavery, on a daily basis. And just down the street is the home of another family connected to Robert Scott, the Isaac West family. In the 1830s, 40% of the property right here on Main Street was owned by free people of color. 3 blocks here on this side of Main Street were owned by a couple, by David Isaacs and by Nancy West. David Isaacs was a Jewish merchant. He came over here from Germany.
From Frankfurt on Main, in fact.
Yeah, specifically from Frankfurt on Main.
And then he ended up in Richmond.
And wound up in Richmond, and then moved here to Charlottesville because of the opportunities provided. And then David Isaacs, he became friends with Colonel Thomas Bell. And David Isaacs formed a relationship with a woman, Nancy West, who was, we'd say, biracial today, And she's a free woman of color. She's a property owner. They have several children together, but can they legally marry?
No, not quite yet.
No.
In fact, not quite for another century.
Yeah, until Loving versus Virginia,
In
the
1967.
Supreme Court case, 1967.
Exactly.
Imagine all the way back then, kind of the predecessor to Loving versus Virginia. Now the Isaac West family, they become sufficiently successful that they weren't hiding anymore, were they? In 1820, they started living openly as, well, I guess as husband and wife. And do you think that went over well with the power structure here in Charlottesville?
No, in fact, it didn't go very well. And oftentimes they would live in separate buildings, in separate homes, and they were moving their money around, they were moving their kids around. It was tough times.
Yeah, and then David Isaacs, he starts transferring property over to Nancy West. So
and
that
Nancy West even had property from her father.
she inherited property. So she's becoming a larger and larger property owner, and she's African American. That's not going to go over well with the white power structure. They're even taken to court being accused of, well, the term they were using was promiscuous fornication. And how did that court case turn out?
It actually turned out better than you would think.
They won.
That's right.
Their relationship was deemed to be legal because they were living openly as husband and wife. Now they have a big family. Liz and I, we want to talk to you about two members of that family who find themselves connected back into the Hemmings family.
Because everyone you know is connected.
Everyone's connected.
Everyone's connected. So this is an image of Elizabeth Ann Fawcett. And she is the granddaughter of Mary Bell. And Elizabeth Ann Fawcett lives in that house that we were looking at earlier. And she falls in love with David Isaacs' son, and his name?
Tucker Isaacs.
Tucker Isaacs.
He's a builder. He's a carpenter.
Right here, in fact, on the downtown mall, and a painter and a glazier.
Yeah. So they fall in love and marry, and they begin a family here in Charlottesville. But the law is changing. The law is making it more and more difficult to survive as a free black in Charlottesville. And in the meantime, well, Tucker Isaacs' sister, Julia Ann, falls in love with,
oh my gosh,
Eston
Hemmings.
And Liz has got a image there of
this is Eston Hemmings, one of his sons and grandsons. Eston Hemmings and his family moved from Charlottesville, and they moved all the way to Chillicothe, Ohio. And in Chillicothe, Ohio, they were considered to be free people of color. They were considered to be black, free black. And after a couple of years, Eston Hemmings and his wife and their 3 children decided to move further away. And they moved all the way north to Madison, Wisconsin. And when they moved to Madison, Wisconsin, they took the last name of Jefferson, and they were accepted as a white family. This was a white family then in Madison, Wisconsin. And some of these 3 young men, the great-grandchildren, some of them ended up in Chicago, Illinois, as attorneys and as doctors.
So the journey continues.
The journey always continues.
From Monticello to Charlottesville to Ohio to Wisconsin, Illinois, and beyond. So it is a story of identity, isn't it?
It is a story of identity.
Well, among Eston Hemmings and Julia Ann Hemmings' children, a man born right here is Johnwales Hemmings. And when Eston Hemmings moved to Madison, Wisconsin, changed his name to Jefferson, he's passing as white. And of course, he's taking the name Jefferson. That's his father, Thomas Jefferson. His mom, Sally Hemings. So Johnwales Jefferson grows up in Madison, Wisconsin. When the Civil War breaks out, Johnwales Jefferson becomes an officer in the United States Army. He rises through the ranks. He actually becomes the commanding officer of the 8th Wisconsin Volunteer Infantry Regiment, Colonel Johnwales Jefferson. He's wounded in battle. He's wounded at Vicksburg. He's wounded at Corinth. He's commended for his bravery by General William Tecumseh Sherman. He's a hero of the Civil War. He's fighting to end that problem, end that system of slavery. He's fighting for the ideals of his grandfather, Thomas Jefferson. Right here, well, this was where the blacksmith shop was, the blacksmith shop of Joseph Fawcett, who was freed from slavery in Jefferson's will, and then who dedicated his life from 1827 to 1837 to freeing as many members of his family that he possibly could, managing to buy the freedom of his wife, of many. He was actually never able to buy the freedom of all of his children, and he wasn't able to buy the freedom of his son, Peter Fawcett. Peter Fawcett was owned by Colonel John R. Jones, and Colonel John R. Jones, he refused to sell Peter Fawcett back to his father. But Peter Fawcett, he was a presence here in Charlottesville. He's running errands for the Jones family. You might imagine him coming right here, coming to see his dad, get a few words with his dad, and imagine the conversation that might have taken place between father and son when Joseph Fawcett and the family that he'd freed make that decision to move from Charlottesville to Cincinnati. They're leaving in 1837, leaving their son behind in slavery. But Peter Fawcett did gain his freedom. In 1850, he'd run away from the Joneses several times. He was forging manumission papers for other enslaved people. And Colonel Jones had had enough, was going to sell him, and the Fawcett family, they gathered those resources at last to buy the freedom of their son. Peter Fawcett, he joins the family in Cincinnati. He opens up a catering business. He becomes known as the Reverend Peter Fawcett, today known as the father of the Black Baptist Church in Ohio. He and his brother, William Fawcett, they're agents in the Underground Railroad. He's fighting for freedom. And his wife, Sarah Mayron Fawcett, well, she's fighting for freedom too. This couple is fighting for freedom together. And what's her story? Sarah Fawcett, she was a hairdresser, and she's the hairdresser to white women, to African American women in Cincinnati. She's well known. She tried to board a Cincinnati streetcar, African Americans free or not. They couldn't ride the streetcars. She was pushed off that streetcar, dragged for a block, and then went to court suing the Cincinnati Streetcar Company for the right to ride a streetcar. And the court found in her favor. What is this, 100 years before Rosa Parks makes her brave decision to sit in the front of the bus. So the Fawcetts, Peter Fawcett, his wife Sarah, they're pioneers in the civil rights movement prior to, during, and then after the Civil War.
So this house that you see with the red door, this is original. This was here. Mary saw this house too. It was owned by Opie Norris. He was a blacksmith here in Charlottesville. In fact, he is the man who sold his blacksmith shop to Mr. Fawcett, and that would be Peter Fawcett's dad. And I know you've seen images of Peter Fawcett before, but I wondered if you'd like to see an image of one of Peter Fawcett's descendants. So let me show that to you. This is Tracy Austin. He is not the grandson of Peter Fawcett. He is the great, maybe one more great grand nephew of Peter Fawcett. I took this photo of Tracy probably about 15 years ago. He and his wife were visiting Monticello. I happened to be with them, and they said they're related, and I thought, what an opportunity to get a photo of one of the descendants. So I asked Tracy, may I take your photograph? And his answer was, sure, Liz, keep the stories alive. So this photo was lovely, I thought, of Tracy Austin, but Karen, his wife, said, you know, Liz, you should really have Tracy full face, because he really does look so much like Peter Fawcett. So this is what she did for me. She took a photo of Tracy at home and made this composite for me.
In 1900, at the age of 85, Peter Fawcett, the Reverend Peter Fawcett, comes home one last time. He visits Monticello, he visits Charlottesville, the town that he grew up in, and imagine the remarkable changes. Virtually everyone that he knew growing up here, well, some have died, like Robert Scott, certainly many others, his whole family, the Hemings family, Madison Hemings, Eston Hemings, now Eston Hemings Jefferson, they've all moved to Ohio, to Wisconsin, to New England, to the West Coast. Changes all around him. But something hasn't changed, even though it's 1900. Even though the Civil War has ended, slavery has ended. Peter Fawcett is dealing with the problem of slavery, with the legacy of slavery, with the problem of racism, with the problem of people being treated differently and worse simply because of the color of their skin. So Peter Fawcett's struggle, it's not over. Peter Fawcett's descendants, the struggle is not over. And in a lot of ways, all these families who made the transition from slavery at Monticello to freedom here in Charlottesville and beyond, they're struggling to do what? To make the words of the Declaration of Independence not just words, but to make them a reality, not only for the few, but a reality for everyone.
So this is a little bit of backstory. And you might be wondering by now, how do we know all the things that we know? Where did we ever get all that information? And I have to tell you, it really comes down to one wonderful woman and two of her very good friends. Cinder Stanton was a 40-year historian at Monticello, and one of her jobs was to go find more information about the enslaved families. Find out first names, find out last names, find out relationships, and that's how she spent her time. She's a wonderful author, and she wrote a book, and it's called Those Who Labor for My Happiness. And a part of that book is one small section, I think it's like 9 pages long, and guess what it's called? Monticello to Main Street. She documented all the information that David and I have been talking about. That's why we know what we know. And the two friends of Cinder Stanton's, let me show them to you all. They also helped get information about descendants, and more than that, meet with descendants. That's why Tracy Austin was here. He's a descendant. So this is Beverly Gray. Beverly Gray lives in Chillicothe, Ohio, and she's the type of woman who knows everybody, and everybody knows her. So when she asked for them to come so that Cinder Stanton could have a conversation with them, they came. And Cinder Stanton is the woman who is in the middle here. And then the woman on this far end is no longer with us. Diane Swanwright has passed away, but she really was the person who initiated the Getting Word program with these two as well. And the Getting Word is all about finding the families and gathering their stories, and how kind descendants have been for us to share their stories with us. And when I talk about descendants, I'm talking about descendants. And you see a photograph like this, these are descendants. And when they get together, it's like family because they are family. And the easiest way to explain that, as they explained to me, we're cousins. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, Liz, here we are walking up to Main Street on 4th Street, but
Oh, David.
this is Heather Higher Way.
Oh, David.
So
That was a sad day.
it was a sad day in the history of Charlottesville. is filled with tragedy and triumph,
Still.
not just back in,
Centuries.
yeah. So that job of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is never ending, is it?
No, it's not. We'll just keep on trying.
Wow, that was so moving, so informative. Thank you, Liz and David, for that. And thank you for being with us today. To learn more about Monticello's enslaved community, please go to monticello.org. Go to the Getting Word Oral History section of that website. There you'll learn more about the people who lived and worked here. You'll learn more about my family. You'll learn more about their contributions, not only to Charlottesville, but to the region and to our country. Monticello is a special place for all of us, especially for the descendants of this community. This is our home. Our ancestors lived and worked here. We value this place. It's a place to learn and to grow. Please join us in learning our history. Thank you.